Well, it's an interesting question, and time will tell. I think the logic is there that by reducing the frequency of full contact sports would reduce concussions. But I think the big question is going to be whether there's a difference between practice and game time and concussion. The literature is not quite clear about that. There's actually not a lot of literature on concussions with youth under 12 years of age, so we still have a lot more to learn about whether that's going to have a large impact or not. Well, I think the key right now is there's been so much media and frenzy about concussions and some of these isolated examples of people committing suicide and pro athletes. And so I think moving away from the fear about concussion and really moving towards the educational part of it. So part of that is certainly being able to, when we talk about prevention, it's not necessarily just stopping play or limiting it. I think one is being able to identify what the signs and symptoms of a concussion are. Particularly back in decades ago, we would just buck up, get back on the field, and you'd fight through it. Now what we've learned, one of the key components is removing a player from the field and not returning to play at least within 24 hours. And so really as we start to gather more evidence of what a concussion looks like, and then being able to treat that following and preventing athletes particularly of getting back on the field too soon. Well, so again, right now these are some questions that are unclear. We don't have answers to them, other than I think there's an emphasis on how do we prevent head injuries and more importantly, cumulative injuries. So a repetitive injury, one of the keys about a concussion, and fortunately most people recover very well. Upwards towards 90% of people recover within a few days to weeks. And the key is that people are going back either into their employment or back to school or back to their on the field, and they're doing it too soon. And so with regard to the practice situation is, time is going to tell whether or not limiting duration and the number of practices in full contact has any impact on preventing concussions. But I think the key is, again, coming back to education and knowing what are the signs and symptoms of a concussion, then having the players rest and not return to play until they're fully evaluated by a medical team. Well, I think there's been a shift in the culture. One of the things that we are much more aware about what a concussion is and limiting as far as people returning back to play. So again, I think that by having these professionals or these outside people monitoring our practices, again, what we're going to do is try to provide education to not only the coaching but the schools, and nowadays a lot of youth sports are volunteer parents, and so there's been a big push in a lot of in these smaller youth groups with soccer, with biking, with football, with basketball, about looking for the signs and symptoms and removing these children as soon as possible. And that right now is the big key. What Gavin Newsom signed into law will have we'll find out in years to come if there's a change as far as the prevalence of mild head injuries or concussions. At this point, again, it's unclear whether that's going to have any impact on the number of concussions and or the residual symptoms and problems that people have following a concussion. Again, as I stated, most people recover quite well after a concussion. Upwards toward 90% of the people recover within a few days to a few weeks.
Is there any youth sport that is safe to play?
Well, I would say that actually a lot of sports are pretty safe to play. Nowadays, the number one risk factor for concussion is biking. And so what have we done as a culture? Nowadays, when we look around, we see pretty much all youth wearing a helmet. If we don't, actually, it is something that somebody would say something, and it's a law that you have to wear a helmet. So that's been already a cultural shift of preventing or reducing the number of head injuries and the problems that people have as a result of that. So as far as safety, there's never going to be a pure safety as far as it. Sports. The population that has more head injuries are birth to 4 and adolescents. So really you have kind of a two subset. Now, children that are birth to 4, they're not playing youth sports, but they're also still at a high rate of having head injuries for probably obvious reasons. Well, so a small subset of individuals, particularly if they go back to play or work too soon, is they'll have protracted symptoms. So they have symptoms that might last for 3 months, 6 months, a year, not necessarily lifelong, but what they call, in some people terms, post-concussion syndrome, is where people are still experiencing these signs and symptoms of concussion, again, months and months, and if not, sometimes years later. And usually one of the reasons for that is because they've returned back to their activity too soon.
Before
they fully recovered.
They've fully recovered or
Yes.
healed from it.
And that's why you see in all major sports nowadays, the concussion programs they're putting in place with Major League Baseball and football and hockey and down the road, where they're having people evaluate them and they're taking $1-million athletes off the field, sometimes for weeks, right? And that's a huge impact economically, but they recognize that they're needing to do that because they need to allow that brain to heal fully. And that when we talk about concussion healing, it doesn't mean that they do nothing, you know, for days at a time where they just rest or they sleep. Actually, the first 24 hours you rest, and then after that, you do recommend light to moderate activity levels to stimulate the brain, which is a little bit counterintuitive, but it is important that you do provide some level of stimulation.